The morning Lenora Vale rode up Black Hollow Ridge, every soul in town came out to watch her die. Not with weapons, with silence. They lined the muddy street, blacksmiths, merchants, mothers clutching their children, and not one of them said a word to stop her, because everyone in Black Hollow Ridge knew what waited at the top of that mountain. Everyone knew what Thorn Mercer did to the last woman, foolish enough to say yes to him. And yet Lenora rode on. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. Chapter 1. The notice on the post office wall. The paper had been tacked to the post office wall on a Tuesday morning in late October, the ink still fresh enough to smear when Deputy Hollis pressed his thumb against it, confirming it was real. Seeking a wife, mountain work, hard winters, man of means, no patience for pretense, inquire, Thorn Mercer, Black Hollow Ridge. Deputy Hollis read it 3 times. Then he walked across the street to the saloon, ordered a whiskey at 9 in the morning, and didn't say a word to anyone for the better part of an hour. By noon, everyone in town had read it. By supper, everyone had laughed. Thorn Mercer. Old Cass Whitmore said the name the way you'd say the name of a sickness. She was sitting in her usual chair outside the general store, smoking her pipe, watching the commotion around the post office with eyes that had seen 43 years of frontier nonsense and weren't easily impressed. That man wants a wife, Lord above. Her granddaughter, a girl of 12 who should have been sweeping the store, had crept up beside her. What's wrong with him? What isn't? Cass blew a ring of smoke. You know the Harker boys, the 3 brothers who came through 2 summers ago with the cattle drive? Big men, mean men. Yes, ma'am. Thorn Mercer threw all 3 of them off his property in one afternoon. One of them didn't walk right for 6 months. She tapped her pipe against the chair arm. He doesn't ask for things twice. He doesn't forgive debts, and he hasn't come down from that mountain in 4 years except to buy flour and ammunition and ride straight back up, without speaking to a living soul. The girl thought about this. So no woman's going to answer that notice? Cass snorted. Not unless she's got a death wish or she's lost her mind completely. 3 women in town had responded to similar notices before, not from Mercer, but from rough mountain men who wanted a homestead wife and not much else. All 3 had come back inside a season, 2 of them crying, one of them with a look in her eyes that made people stop asking questions. The frontier had its own rules about marriage, and most of those rules were written for men. So the notice stayed on the wall. People talked, people laughed or shook their heads or made grim little jokes about it at the supper table. And on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the paper appeared, Lenora Vale walked to the post office, stood in front of the notice for a long moment, and took it down. Nobody saw her do it. That was the remarkable thing. Lenora Vale was not a small woman. She was the kind of woman you noticed in a room. Broad-shouldered, full-figured, with heavy hands that had calluses on every finger from 17 years of needlework, and a face that wasn't pretty in the way the town valued pretty, though it was striking in its own fashion. Strong jaw, dark, serious eyes, a mouth that didn't smile often, but when it did so like it meant it. She was 31 years old. She'd never been married. She ran the only seamstress shop on the main street, and she was good enough at her work that people who didn't like her still brought her their torn coats and wedding dresses, because there wasn't anyone in 3 counties who could work a needle the way Lenora Vale could. She paid her bills on time. She kept mostly to herself. She had a cat named Marshall that she sometimes talked to in the evenings when the shop was closed and quiet. And she took Thorn Mercer's notice off the wall and folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her coat, and she walked home, and she sat at her work table for a long time thinking. Her friend Dottie Crane found out about it the next day, because Dottie found out about everything. "Tell me you didn't," Dottie said. She was standing in the doorway of the seamstress shop, still holding her market basket, her face arranged into the particular expression she reserved for disasters. "Lenora, tell me right now that you did not write back to that man." Lenora was pinning the hem of a wool skirt and didn't look up. "I wrote back to that man." Dottie stepped inside and shut the door behind her, dropping her voice to a frantic whisper. Lenora Vale, have you taken leave of your senses? Do you know what people say about Thorne Mercer? I know exactly what people say. Lenora turned the skirt, checked the line. I also know that people say a lot of things that aren't true, and sometimes things that are. Sometimes. She pulled a pin from between her lips. But I've been running the shop for 11 years, Dottie. I'll be running it in another 11 if I don't do something different. I'm tired. Dottie sat down heavily on the stool by the door. Tired of what? Your shop is fine. You have a good life. I have a quiet life. Lenora finally looked up. Her voice wasn't bitter exactly, but there was something in it that was past soft. There's a difference. Dottie opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her friend, really looked, the way you stop doing after you've known someone long enough that you think you already see them, and something shifted in her expression. He's dangerous, she finally said. Maybe. Lenora looked back down at her work. But so was this town when I first came here, and I managed. Thorne Mercer wrote back in 8 days. His letter was 4 sentences long. He said he had a homestead of 300 acres on the high ridge, a house that was sound but plain, livestock that needed tending, and winters that killed people who weren't prepared for them. He said he was not a gentleman, but he was not a dishonest one. He said he needed a wife who could work and not flinch at hard things. He said if she still wanted to meet, he'd come down to town on the first Friday of November. Lenora read the letter twice, then she wrote back and said Friday would be fine. Chapter 2, First Friday of November. He was bigger than she'd expected. She'd expected big. Everyone said big. But Thorne Mercer standing outside the post office at 9 in the morning was something that descriptions hadn't quite prepared her for. 6 feet and 4 inches of solid, weathered man, dressed in heavy canvas and worn leather, with shoulders that looked like they'd been built for hauling loads that would have broken most backs. His face was rough cut and deeply scarred along the left jaw, a long old scar, the kind that came from something with claws. And his dark eyes found her across the street with an immediacy that felt more like an animal's calculation than a greeting. I didn't smile, he didn't wave, he just looked at her, and then he walked across the street without checking if anything was coming. A horse had to stop for him. The driver swore. Thorne didn't acknowledge it. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. This close, he smelled like pine smoke and horses and something cold and mineral. Mountain air, she realized, caught in the fibers of his coat. You're Lenora Vale, he said. It wasn't a question. And you're Thorne Mercer. She offered her hand. He looked at it for a moment, just a half second, like the gesture surprised him. And then he shook it. His grip was enormous and careful at the same time, the way a man handles something he suspects is fragile even when it isn't. You're not what I pictured, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Neither are you. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, closer to respect. Where do you want to talk? There's a diner 2 streets over that does good coffee. She started walking. Try to keep up. He made a sound behind her that might have been a laugh. She didn't look back to check. They sat across from each other in the corner booth of Mabel's diner, which went very quiet when Thorne Mercer walked through the door and stayed very quiet for the entirety of their conversation. Mabel herself brought the coffee without being asked, set it down without a word, and retreated to a safe distance behind the counter where she could pretend to wipe things. Lenora added cream to her coffee. Thorne drank his black and said nothing for a moment, just looked at the table with the air of a man who had rehearsed something and had already decided to say it differently. I'll tell you what my place is, he finally said, and I'll tell you what I need, and you can decide. All right? The house is solid, 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a root cellar. The land's got pasture and timber. I've got 4 horses, 12 cattle, a small flock of sheep. His voice was flat, factual, like he was reciting inventory. Winters on the ridge are long. Last year the first snow came in October, and it didn't fully clear until April. It gets cold enough that you can't stay outside more than an hour without risking your fingers. I grew up in Vermont, she said. I know cold. He nodded once, kept going. There are no close neighbors, The nearest settlement is 4 miles down the east slope. I don't socialize much. If you came, you'd need to be someone who doesn't need a crowd. I don't need a crowd. He looked at her then, really looked, the same calculating animal assessment he'd given her across the street. She met it without blinking. There have been problems with some of the men who control land east of the ridge, he said. Land disputes. It hasn't turned violent, but it could. You should know that before you agree to anything. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What kind of men? The kind who want things that belong to other people and have enough money to make the law look the other way. He said it simply, without heat, like it was just another fact about the weather. My land sits on top of the best water table in this part of the mountains. People have been trying to get it for 10 years, and yet you still have it. I'm still here, he agreed. She thought for a moment. The diner was silent enough that she could hear the cook moving pans in the back room. Can I ask you something? He waited. The last woman who answered your notice, before me. She kept her voice even. What happened? His jaw tightened, just barely. She came up for a week in September 2 years ago, left on the 3rd day. He paused. I don't know exactly what she told people when she got back. She told people you threw her things into the yard and told her to get out. That's partly true, he said. What's the other part? He looked at the table again. She went through my things, private things, letters. His voice had gone quieter, flatter. He stopped, started over. I don't mind a woman who asks questions. I do mind one who goes looking for answers I haven't offered yet. Lenora considered that. It wasn't a great answer. It was also, she thought, probably an honest one. I won't go through your things, she said, but I'll ask a lot of questions directly. I can live with that, and I expect the same in return. If something concerns you about me or about how I'm doing or what I'm thinking, and you ask, you don't go silent and let it fester. He looked at her for a long moment. Women usually don't talk to me this way. I know. She picked up her coffee. Is it a problem? He thought about it. No, he said, it's not. Chapter 3. What the town said. She told him she'd come. She said it quietly at the end of their conversation, while Mabel was making a great show of rearranging coffee cups at the far end of the counter. Thorne looked at her like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly, and then he asked if she was sure. I'm sure, she said. I'll need 3 weeks to close up my shop and arrange things. 3 weeks, he said, like he was testing the reality of the words. Fine, I'll send a wagon. I'll drive myself. Another one of those almost smiles. All right. He left without lingering, which she appreciated. She sat with her coffee for another 10 minutes, letting the diner slowly come back to life around her. Conversations resuming, the cook starting to move freely again, Mabel inching back toward the table to collect the cups. You know, Mabel said carefully, most folks around here think he killed a man up on that ridge. Most folks think a lot of things. Lenora put her money on the table and stood. Thank you for the coffee, Mabel. It was good. The 3 weeks were an education. Word spread the way it always did in Black Hollow Ridge. Someone told someone, who told 3 people at church, who told their husbands, who mentioned it at the hardware store, and within 48 hours, the entire town knew that Lenora Vale had accepted Thorne Mercer's proposal. The responses came in roughly 3 varieties. The first variety was disbelief. A delegation of 4 women from the Ladies' Aid Society appeared at her shop on a Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to pick up mended table linens, but actually to stage an intervention. Their spokesperson, a tall woman named Mrs. Fenton, stood in the center of the shop and explained with great care that what Lenora was proposing to do was either very brave or very foolish, and that the society hoped it was the latter because foolish could be corrected, but brave tended to get people killed. Lenora thanked them for their concern and asked if they wanted their tablecloths now or when they were fully pressed. The second variety was pity. She saw it in the way people's eyes changed when she walked down the street. That particular combination of sorrow and voyeuristic fascination. The look you give someone you've already written off. Some people were kind about it. Old Cass Whitmore stopped her outside the general store and pressed her hand and said, "You're a tough woman, Lenora Vale. I hope it's enough." She meant it well. It still felt like a funeral. The third variety was cruelty, and it was the most honest. She heard it from a group of men outside the saloon one evening when she was walking back from the telegraph office, not directed at her, not quite loud enough to be certain she was meant to hear, but not quiet enough either. Suppose even Mercer can't do better. Can't blame her for trying. Nobody else ever going to want that. She'll be down from that mountain inside a month, maybe less if he loses his temper. She kept walking. Her hands were steady. She'd been hearing things like that her whole life, had heard them at 16, at 20, at 25, and 28, and 31. And she'd long since stopped letting them knock her off stride, which wasn't the same thing as not hearing them. She still heard them. She just didn't stop. Big. Chapter 4. The drive up. She loaded her wagon on the last Monday of November. Dottie helped because Dottie, despite her fears, was the kind of friend who showed up when it mattered. They worked in the cold morning light, packing Lenora's sewing box, her books, her winter clothes, the good cast iron skillet she'd bought herself 3 years ago and refused to leave behind, and Marshall the cat, who expressed his opinion of the whole enterprise by scratching Dottie's hand and hiding under the bed for 40 minutes. "You have everything you need?" Dottie asked for the 4th time. "I have everything I own," Lenora said, which is essentially the same thing. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. She tied the last rope on the load and turned to look at her friend. Dottie's eyes were wet, which she was trying to pretend they weren't. "Don't cry." "I'm not crying." "Dottie, I'm not." Dottie pressed her knuckle against her upper lip, held it for a moment. "Write to me, you hear? You write to me." Every week Lenora hugged her, a real solid hug, the kind that said more than words. "I'll be fine." "You don't know that." "No," she agreed, "but I'm going anyway." The road up Black Hollow Ridge was 4 miles of switchbacks and rocks and roots that crossed the packed earth trail in ways that required constant attention. She'd borrowed a good strong horse from the livery, a grey mare named Pebble, who turned out to be exactly as sensible as her name suggested. And they picked their way up through the bare-armed November forest, while Marshall sat in a basket in the wagon bed and glared at everything with supreme disdain. She'd expected to be scared. She wasn't particularly. There was a knot of something in her chest, nerves probably, or the particular anxiety of having made a large and irreversible decision. But not fear exactly. She was watching the mountain. It was beautiful in the way severe things are beautiful, enormous and cold and indifferent, the kind of place that didn't particularly care whether you survived it. She could respect that. The homestead came into view around 2 in the afternoon, when the light had gone thin and gold-grey between the trees. She saw the roof first, a sturdy, snow-weighted thing above a low ridge of rock, and then the house below it, bigger than she'd expected, built of dark timber, with a wide porch and a stone chimney throwing a steady thread of smoke into the pale sky. Thorne was on the porch. He must have heard the wagon, or maybe he'd been watching the road. He was standing with his arms at his sides, in the same heavy canvas coat he'd worn in town, and he was watching her come up the last 100 yards of trail with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, got down without waiting for help. He came down the porch steps, stopped 6 feet away. "You made it," he said. "Of course I made it." She started untying the load. "The mare's name is Pebble. She'll need water and feed. I'll take care of her." He came around the wagon, looked at the cat basket. Marshall stared back at him with maximum hostility. "That the cat? That's Marshall. What happened to his ear? He was like that when I got him." She lifted the basket. "Where's the kitchen?" He pointed. She walked. Behind her, she heard him say something to the horse, a low, even murmur, the tone you'd use for something you knew how to handle. And then the sound of Pebble's hooves moving toward the barn. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the door. Then she opened it and went in. Chapter 5. Inside the house. The house smelled like wood smoke and something sharp, pine resin probably, and something else underneath that she needed a moment to identify. loneliness, that was the smell. Not quite neglect, but close. The smell of a space that had been inhabited by one person for a very long time and had organized itself around his habits and his silences and his particular way of moving through the world. The kitchen was in better shape than she'd expected. Good stove, well maintained. Solid table, 2 chairs, she noticed, with a small pang of something, that there were exactly 2 chairs, which meant he'd bought one before she arrived. Shelves with provisions. A window above the sink that looked out over the back slope of the ridge. She set Marshall's basket down. He immediately pushed the door open and stalked out with enormous dignity, did a circuit of the kitchen with his nose 2 inches from the floor, then sat in front of the stove and began to wash his face. She started unpacking her kitchen things. She was still unpacking when Thorne came in from the barn, stomping snow off his boots at the door. He stood there for a moment, watching her. She could feel his eyes moving around the kitchen, registering changes. Her skillet on the hook, her jars lined up on the counter. Marshall installed in front of the stove as though he'd always lived there. I can move things back if you... No. He came in fully, hung up his coat. It's fine. He sat down at the table. She kept working. The silence between them was strange, not hostile, not comfortable, but something in between. Like 2 people learning the acoustics of a new room. I made stew this morning, he said, in case you were hungry from the drive. She turned. He was looking at the table, not at her. Thank you, she said, and meant it. He nodded once, got up and went to the stove and lifted a pot onto the burner, and she watched his big hands be very careful and precise about the adjustment of the flame, and she thought, all right, there's something here to work with. They ate mostly in silence, not uncomfortable silence, she decided, more like 2 people who were both thinking and had enough respect for each other not to fill the space with noise just to fill it. He ate like a man who had spent a long time eating alone, focused, efficient, no performance about it. She appreciated that too. You'll need different boots, he said after a while. She looked up. I was looking at her feet. What you drove up in is fine for town. Up here with the ice and the depth of the snow will get, you need something heavier. I can make a pair, or we can order from the supply post. You make boots? I've made most of what I have. He said it without pride, just as fact. You learn to make things up here, or you go without. She considered her current boots. He was right. They were good quality, well made, but made for a different kind of terrain. I'd like a pair made, she said, if you're willing to do the work. I'm willing. I'll need to know your measurements. I can... He stopped, looked at her. You're going to make me something? I make things, she said. That's what I do. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. That particular combination of wariness and surprise, like a man who kept expecting to be tricked. What would you make? Whatever you need, she lifted her spoon. What do you need? I thought about it for a moment, and she could see him genuinely thinking, not performing thought, but actually considering the question. Gloves, he finally said. I go through gloves badly. The cold and the work, they don't last. Show me the pair you have now. I'll figure out the pattern. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a glove that had been repaired at least 3 times, patched in 2 places, with a split running along the right thumb seam. He put it on the table between them. She picked it up, turned it over, examined the construction. I can do better than this, she said. Something shifted in his face. Small, but there. I imagine you can, he said. Chapter 6. The First Weeks. She learned the house by moving through it. Not quickly. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed to understand everything immediately. She moved into it the way water finds its level, slowly, finding where things worked and where they didn't, what the house needed and what she needed, and where those 2 things lined up. The bedroom he'd given her was small and cold, and had a window that let in a knife of wind through a poor seal at the bottom. She stuffed it with cloth on the second night, and told him the next morning that it would need proper fixing before the deep cold came. He fixed it that afternoon without discussion, working in silence for 2 hours while she organized the root cellar, and when she checked the window that evening, the seal was tight and solid. They didn't talk much, but they talked. The first real conversation happened at the end of her 5th day on the ridge, when she'd been outside helping him move split wood to the covered pile and had slipped on ice and gone down hard on one knee. She'd gotten up before he could help her. She'd been falling down and getting up by herself for 31 years and saw no reason to change the policy now. But he'd stopped what he was doing and stood watching her, and she'd seen something in his face that wasn't mockery. "Happens to me too," he said. "Ice doesn't care how big you are," she said, brushing off her coat. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't care about anything." They'd stood there for a moment, the cold pressing around them, the tree still against a grey sky. "That's a mountain answer," she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean you sound like someone who's been talking to mountains for long enough that you've started talking like them. They say things that are true, but remove the human part." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been up here a long time." "How long?" He bent down and picked up a log. 8 years. "On your own?" "Yes." She helped him stack wood for another few minutes before she said, "That's a long time to be by yourself." "I know," he said. That was all, but it was enough for that day to build something on. She wrote to Dottie every Sunday as promised. The letters were honest but not complete. She didn't know how to explain the strangeness of the place, the particular quiet of the ridge in the morning, the way Thorn moved through the space around her like he was still learning to account for her presence. She told Dottie about the house, the land, the livestock. She described Marshall's conquest of the armchair by the fire, which Thorn had accepted with better grace than she'd expected. She didn't tell Dottie about the men she'd seen watching the property from the tree line on her 9th day. She'd been at the kitchen window just after dawn when she'd seen them. 2 riders sitting still among the birches at the far edge of the south pasture, not moving, just watching. She'd watched them back for 3 minutes before they turned and rode away through the trees. When Thorn came in from the barn, she told him what she'd seen. Han went still in the way she was learning meant he was working something through. Where exactly? She described it. His jaw tightened. He went to the window himself, looked out at the tree line. "Holt's men," he said. "Wendell Holt. He owns most of the eastern flatland between here and the settlement. And he wants your land. He's wanted it for 6 years." He turned from the window. "The water table under this ridge feeds everything on the east slope. Wells, livestock, irrigation. Whoever controls this land controls the water. Have you talked to him?" A sound that might have been a laugh in a different context. "We've had conversations. They don't go well." She stood with her coffee, looking at the tree line. "What does he do when conversations don't go his way?" Thorn was quiet for a moment. "He finds other methods." She found out what other methods looked like on a Thursday in her 3rd week on the ridge. She'd been in the settlement, 4 miles down the east slope, a rough collection of maybe 60 people, a trading post, a blacksmith, a small church, buying thread, and a few household supplies. She'd taken the wagon herself, which Thorn hadn't been entirely comfortable with, but had accepted when she pointed out she was a grown woman who had been operating independently for over a decade. She was loading her purchases onto the wagon outside the trading post when a woman appeared beside her, small woman, 30s, with tired eyes and work-roughened hands. She looked at Lenora for a moment like she was deciding something. "You're the one from the ridge," the woman said, "Mercer's wife." "That's right." Lenora tied a knot. "Lenora Vale. Lenora Mercer, I suppose, though I haven't entirely gotten used to the second part." The woman glanced around the street. "My name's Agatha Briggs. My husband runs the blacksmith." She paused. "You should be careful coming down here." Lenora stopped what she was doing. "Why?" "Holt's got people in the settlement. Not many, but enough." Agatha's voice was low, careful. "They watch what comes and goes from the ridge, and they talk." "Talk about what?" "About your husband, about his land." She looked at her hands. "My husband says Holt's been putting pressure on people, telling them Mercer's a dangerous man, that the ridge land should be properly managed, that if something happened to Mercer—" She stopped. "I shouldn't be telling you this." "You're telling me anyway," Lenora said. Agatha looked at her. "You're not what we expected," she said. Lenora picked up her last package. "No one seems to know what to expect from me," she said. "Maybe that's useful." She drove back up the ridge with the thread and the provisions and a great deal to think about. Chapter 7, What She Learned. The thing about Thorne Mercer was that he didn't explain himself. He didn't say, "This is who I am and why I'm this way." He didn't offer up his history like a card on the table. He was a man who had built himself very carefully into someone who didn't require other people, and the construction was solid and load-bearing, and had been standing for long enough that he'd probably stopped seeing it as a construction at all. But she was observant. She'd spent 17 years in a seamstress shop watching people, their faces when they thought no one was looking, the way they held their bodies when they were lying or afraid or angry or quietly proud. She'd learned to read the space between what people said and what they meant, and she watched Thorne Mercer. She watched him with the horses, the particular gentleness he had there, the patience that didn't seem to be effort, the way he talked to the animals in a low, continuous murmur while he worked. She watched him stop to look at the mountains on clear mornings, standing on the porch with his coffee, not doing anything except looking, and she thought, this is a man who can still be moved by beauty. He hasn't killed that. She watched him read. He had books, more books than she'd expected, shelved along the back wall of the main room, well used and carefully kept. History mostly, some science, a few things she wouldn't have predicted. She found a collection of botanical drawings one evening, slipped between two larger volumes, the kind of detailed, beautiful work that took years to produce. "Where did this come from?" she asked, bringing it to the kitchen where he was cleaning a harness. He looked up, looked at the book, a brief change in his face, not quite embarrassment but something close. "Belonged to my mother," he said. She sat down across from him and opened the book carefully. The illustrations were extraordinary, detailed and precise, and somehow also warm, the kind of drawings that weren't just scientific records, but were made by someone who genuinely loved the thing they were drawing. She had good taste, Lenora said. He kept working the harness. She was from back east. She didn't... He stopped. She wasn't meant for a place like this. What happened to her? He was quiet for a long moment, rubbing oil into the leather. She went back when I was 14. My father had died the winter before. She said she couldn't stay. Lenora looked at the book. Did you ever hear from her again? Letters for a while, then they stopped. She turned a page. A detailed drawing of Mountain Columbine, annotated in a small, neat hand. She left the book. I kept it. His voice had gone carefully flat. I don't know why. I think you do, she said. He looked at her then. Not the wary look, not the calculating one. Something else. Something older and less defended. Maybe, he said. She turned another page. Tupsu. The scar she'd noticed on his jaw was from a bear. She found this out on a cold afternoon when she was working on his gloves at the kitchen table, and he came in from outside with a split in the leather of his coat sleeve, sat down with a needle and thread and began mending it himself without mentioning it. She watched him work. He was not terrible at it, better than most men she'd seen, who treated sewing like an insult. He worked steadily, methodically. "Tell me about the scar," she said. I didn't look up. "Which one?" She'd noticed by this point that there were others. A burn scar on the back of his right hand, a puckered place on his left forearm, the jaw, the face. 8 years ago, young bear, early spring. Probably newly out of sleep and confused. He made a stitch, pulled it through. I came around a boulder and walked straight into it. What did you do? Fell down mostly. He said it without irony. Made myself as small as possible and didn't move until it lost interest. She looked up. You didn't fight? You don't fight a bear. He said it like a fact, not a boast. You think you do in your head, but when it actually happens, if you're paying attention, you understand very quickly that the correct answer is stillness. But you survived. I survived because I stopped trying to be bigger than the situation. He turned the coat sleeve, examined the stitching. Not everyone learns that. She thought he was talking about more than bears. What happened before you came up here? She asked. He finished his stitching, put the coat down, sat with his hands on the table. I had a partner, he said, business partner. We were running a trading operation out of Billings, furs mostly, some livestock brokering. 5 years of it. We'd built something real. He paused. He decided to sell our inventory and the contracts we'd built and take the money before I knew what was happening. He'd been planning it for 2 years. I didn't see it. What did you do? I went to the law. His mouth twisted. The law was his cousin, so that went nowhere. He looked at the table. I made some choices after that. Choices I'm not. He stopped. I scared people. I know that. I was angry and I expressed it badly and people got scared. And they weren't wrong to be scared. What kinds of choices? Damaged property. Confrontations that got physical. He met her eyes. I didn't kill anyone. I want to be clear about that. I believe you. Most people don't. I know. She picked up his glove, the finished one, and set it on the table between them. I'm not most people. He looked at the glove, then at her, then back at the glove. He picked it up. This is the best glove I've ever owned, he said. I know, she said. He almost laughed. She was starting to collect those almost laughs, like good findings. Chapter 8. What was watching the riders at the tree line came back on the first real snow. 3 of them this time, still staying at distance in the birches at the south pasture edge, but for longer. She timed them 40 minutes before they turned and left. Thorn had seen them too. Holt's getting impatient, he said that evening. What does impatient look like for a man like that? I was at the window, looking out at the dark pasture. It looks like what's already happening. Watchers. Messengers to the settlement, making sure everyone knows his version of me. He paused. Then it looks like something more direct. How direct? He turned from the window. His face in the lamplight was harder than it usually was in the evenings, the old weariness fully up. He sent men to my barn last winter. I found a cut fence in the spring that cost me 2 calves. He said it flat. He keeps it just below what I can take to law, because there's no law up here. There's Deputy Hollis in town. He's not Holt's man exactly, but he's not inclined to ride 4 miles up a mountain in winter to look at a fence cut. He came away from the window, and because he stopped, because the story about you is already set, she said. Dangerous man, volatile. Nobody wants to take his side in a dispute. His jaw tightened. Yes. She thought about Agatha Briggs in the settlement, about the quiet caution in the woman's eyes, about what she'd said. Holt's been putting pressure on people. How many people in the settlement have reason to be grateful to you? She asked. He looked at her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I asked. Have you helped people, done things quietly over the years that they might remember? I thought about it for a long moment. The Briggs family, their well went bad 2 summers ago. I let them draw from my spring for 3 months. Who else? Old Peterson on the North Slope. His son needed the doctor in town last winter. The boy had a fever. I drove them down in the storm. He frowned. Why does this matter? She sat back. It matters, she said, because a story can be retold if you have the right people telling it. He watched her for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said carefully, that Wendell Holt built his power by making sure everyone heard his version of you. And I'm wondering what would happen if people started hearing a different version, from people they trusted. He was very still. That's not, I don't need people to. This isn't about you needing to be liked, she said. This is about the fact that a man who has your land surrounded by people who believe his enemy's story about you is a man with very few options when that enemy decides to move. A long silence. The stove ticked. You've been thinking about this, he said. Since the first day I saw those riders in the trees, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't seen before on his face. Something that wasn't wariness and wasn't calculation, but was something steadier and more exposed than either. I've been alone up here a long time, he said. I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I don't know how to do what you're suggesting. I know, she said, but I do. She held his gaze. Let me help. He didn't answer right away. The fire settled behind the stove door. All right, he finally said. It was a small word for what it cost him to say it. She understood that. The snow deepened through December, and the temperature dropped to things she'd never quite felt before, even in Vermont, 30 below on the worst nights, the kind of cold that was less like temperature and more like a physical presence, a weight pressing on the house from every side. She adapted. She'd been adapting all her life. She adapted to the cold, to the work, to the rhythm of the ridge, the early mornings, the long silences, the particular sounds the house made in the deep cold, creaking and settling like a ship in slow water. She adapted to Marshall's decision to sleep at the foot of Thorne's bed instead of hers, which she decided to take as a good sign about the man's character and not a personal slight. She adapted to Thorne. Not that he was easy to adapt to. He was not. He had moods that went dark and silent without explanation, hours when he disappeared into the barn or the tree line and came back with his face closed and whatever it was safely locked behind it. He was particular about certain things in ways she hadn't expected. The arrangement of his tools, the specific order in which he did his evening tasks, the fact that he couldn't sleep if the fire was entirely out. She didn't try to change these things. She worked around them the way you work around the immovable features of any landscape. And slowly, week by week, she began to see the shape of him more clearly. Not a monster, never a monster, just a man who'd been broken in certain places and had set the breaks himself in the dark, without anyone to help him hold the pieces while they healed. The fractures were still there. They'd always be there. But the structure they were part of was sound. For big. She started going to the settlement every other Thursday, always with a clear reason. Supplies thread, the occasional letter, but always with her eyes open and her attention on the people around her. She drank tea with Agatha Briggs when the blacksmith's wife offered, which she began doing regularly after the second visit. She stopped to help the Peterson family's daughter carry a heavy load to the trading post and stayed long enough to learn the girl's name and something about her life. She sat in on the small informal gathering at the trading post on the second Thursday, where half a dozen people from the settlement met to share news and complaints, and she listened more than she spoke. She was building something. She didn't tell Thorne in detail, but she told him enough, and he didn't tell her to stop. That, she understood, was its own kind of trust from a man like him. Marshall disappeared for 2 days in late December and came back through the kitchen door at midnight of the second day, looking impossibly smug and with what appeared to be someone's abandoned chicken leg in his mouth. She had no explanation for either. She told Thorne about it the next morning and he laughed. A real laugh. Not almost, not the small shifts of expression she'd been cataloguing. A genuine, full, surprised laugh. The kind that comes out of a person before they can decide whether to let it. It was a good sound. She filed it away with the glove and the botanical book and the story about the bear. In the growing collection of things she understood about him that no one else in the world did. The last Friday before Christmas, she was at the trading post when she overheard 2 men talking near the back shelves. She recognized one of them, a lean man named Casper who worked for Holt, whom she'd seen in the settlement before. He was talking to the trading post owner, and she couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. She heard the word spring. She heard can't wait much longer. She heard time to make it clear to Mercer that his options are running out. She kept her face still and her movements slow, and she bought her supplies and she drove back up the ridge, and that night she sat across from Thorne at the kitchen table and said, I think Holt is going to make a move soon, and I think we need to be ready. He looked at her for a long moment. What kind of ready, he said. The kind, she said, where we're not standing up there alone. The stove burned steadily. Marshall jumped onto her lap, and began to knead her thigh with absolute disregard for her thoughts. Outside, the mountain was dark and cold and enormous, and somewhere below in the settlement, Wendell Holt was making plans. But up here, for the first time in 8 years, Thorne Mercer was not the only person in the room, and Lenora Vale was already thinking 3 moves ahead. January came in mean, the kind of mean that wasn't dramatic about it. No howling storms, no single catastrophic blizzard, just a steady grinding cold that pressed down on the ridge like a hand and didn't lift. The temperature stayed below 0 for 11 consecutive days. The horses' water buckets froze solid overnight. The windows grew thick interior ice that Lenora scraped every morning with a knife, and still the cold came through. She learned things about herself in that cold. She learned that she was more capable than she'd known and more exhausted than she wanted to admit. She learned that her hands, which she'd always considered her most important tool, could crack and bleed at the knuckles no matter how much she rubbed tallow into them at night. She learned that the particular silence of a mountain winter, not peaceful silence, but the silence of a world that had simply shut down, gone inward, stopped, was something you either made peace with or it made you small. She made peace with it. Thorne watched her adapt without saying much, but she caught him noticing little looks from across the room, across the yard, the kind a man gives when he's quietly revising an opinion he'd already formed. She didn't remark on it. She just kept working. The gloves she'd made him he wore every day. She'd noticed that too. They'd developed a rhythm by January that wasn't exactly comfort yet, but was something functional and surprisingly unforced. She handled the kitchen and the mending and the household accounts, which she'd taken over from his system of crumpled paper and approximation, and she'd started keeping a proper ledger that he'd looked at once with an expression of genuine relief, and handled the livestock and the property and the physical labor that would have taken her twice as long and cost twice the effort. They split the firewood between them, which he'd protested once and let go of when she'd split 6 logs in front of him without comment. Mornings they ate together, mostly quiet. Evenings sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. She read in the evenings and he worked on things with his hands. Harness, tools, the small precise repairs a homestead required constantly. And Marshall sat between them on the rug like a grey referee and cleaned his ears. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't the kind of arrangement that would have made Dottie Crane feel better about anything. But it was real, and it was honest, and Lenora had lived long enough to understand that real and honest were not small things to have. What complicated all of it, what sat underneath the rhythm of daily life like bedrock, was Holt. She hadn't heard anything direct since the conversation she'd overheard in the trading post before Christmas, but the watchers came back in January. Different men, she thought, though at this distance, through the cold and the trees, she couldn't be certain. And twice she found tracks in the snow at the south pasture fence line that didn't belong to any of their animals. Thorne said nothing when she pointed them out the second time, just stood looking at them with his hands at his sides. And she recognized the look. It was the look of a man managing something by main force of will that he was tired of managing. "You should go to Deputy Hollis," she said. "I told you, Hollis isn't going to ride up here in January." "Then write to him. Document the tracks, the watches. Put something on paper." He looked at her. "Why? So when Holt finally does something, I have a record that nobody acted on?" "So when Holt does something," she said, "there's proof that it was Holt, and not some random trouble that you brought on yourself." I was quiet for a moment. The cold was enormous around them. "You think people will believe that?" "I think some people will," she said. "Enough people." He turned back toward the house. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way he carried the weight of 8 years of fighting, the same slow battle that never fully came to a head and never went away. "Write to Hollis," she said again. Hunt did it that evening. She didn't ask to read it. He didn't offer. But she heard the scratch of his pen for a long time after the lamp had gone low. And in the morning there was a sealed letter on the kitchen table addressed to Deputy Hollis, Black Hollow Ridge Township, and she took it down to the settlement herself the next Thursday and mailed it without making a point of it. She was building a paper trail. She was building a network. She was building as quietly and steadily as she built everything. Something that might hold when the pressure came. She just didn't know yet how much pressure was coming. The answer arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of February in the form of Agatha Briggs. Agatha came up the ridge road on horseback alone, which told Lenora immediately that something was wrong. Agatha was not a woman who rode 4 miles up a mountain in February without serious cause. She rode into the yard with her horse blowing great clouds of breath into the cold air, and her face tight with something she'd been holding the whole way up. Lenora was on the porch before the woman had fully dismounted. "Agatha, what happened?" "Is your husband here?" Agatha looked around the yard. "He's in the barn. I'll get him." "Get him," Agatha said. "Both of you need to hear this." Thorne came out of the barn with hay still on his coat, and took one look at Agatha's face and went still, in the way he went still when something required his full attention. They brought her inside. Lenora put coffee on. Agatha sat at the kitchen table and wrapped her hands around the cup and said what she'd ridden 4 miles in February to say. Wendell Holt had called a meeting in the settlement 3 days ago. Private meeting, not public, not announced, at the back room of the trading post after hours. Her husband Silas hadn't been invited, but he'd heard about it from one of the men who had been, a farmer named Gruber, who owed Holt money and had been uncomfortable about what he'd heard, and had drunk too much the following night and talked to the wrong person. What was the meeting about? Thorne asked. He was standing with his back against the wall, arms crossed, very still. Agatha looked at her coffee. Holt told them you'd been making threats against the settlement, that people on the east slope weren't safe with you on that ridge. He said, she paused, he said the only reason you hadn't come down was because you were planning something bigger, something coordinated. Lenora watched Thorne's face go very controlled, the kind of control that cost something. And people believed him, he said. It wasn't a question. Some of them. Agatha looked up. Not all. Gruber didn't, which is why he talked, and Silas didn't. But Holt's been saying versions of the story for years, and every time he says it, more people have heard it, and... She stopped. There's more. Go ahead, Lenora said. He's offered to buy this land, not from you. He's made that offer before, and you've refused. He's offering to purchase the territorial rights through the county seat. He's got a lawyer from Billings coming in spring, who's going to argue that your claim is improperly filed. Thorne was quiet for a long moment. My claim isn't improperly filed. I know that. Silas knows that. Agatha's voice was tired and angry in equal parts. But Holt's got money and a lawyer and a story he's been telling for 6 years, and you've got... She stopped herself. A reputation, Lenora said quietly. Agatha looked at her. I'm sorry. Don't be. Lenora picked up her own coffee. You rode 4 miles in February to tell us this. That's not something to apologize for. Thorne pushed off the wall and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the south pasture where the snow lay flat and white, and the tree line stood dark beyond it, keeping its secrets. He's going to move before spring, he said. What makes you think that? Agatha asked. Because if there's a lawyer coming in spring with a legal argument, Holt needs the story established before then. He needs people already believing I'm dangerous before that lawyer arrives and starts asking questions. His voice was flat. Certain. He's going to do something that looks like I started it. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Lenora set down her cup. All right, she said. Both of them looked at her. Agatha, can you get a message to Gruber without Holt finding out? Agatha blinked. Probably. What kind of message? Ask him to write down exactly what was said at that meeting. Dates, who was present, what Holt said. Ask him to sign it and keep a copy and give a copy to Silas. She paused. Tell him he's not the only one keeping records. Agatha looked at Thorne. Thorne was looking at Lenora. I can do that, Agatha said carefully. Good. Lenora looked at Thorne. The Peterson family on the north slope. You said you drove their son to the doctor in a storm. Yes, he said. Have you spoken to them since? Not since summer. I want to go visit them. He frowned. Lenora, not to recruit them into anything, just to talk. She kept her voice even. People make decisions about who they trust based on who they know. They don't know me yet. Let me fix that. He stared at her for a long moment. She could see him working through his instinct to say no, and his understanding that the instinct was based on the same isolation that had left him exposed for years. Fine, he said, but not alone. Then come with me. He looked at her like the idea of voluntarily riding to a neighbor's house to have a conversation was roughly equivalent to suggesting he swim across the ridge in his boots. Together, she said. It'll be better if we go together. Agatha was watching this exchange with an expression Lenora couldn't quite categorize, something between amusement and a very careful hope. I'll get the message to Gruber, she said, standing. She looked at Thorne. For what it's worth, Mr. Mercer, Silas says you've always been straight with us. He wants you to know that. Thorne looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly. Tell him I appreciate it, he said, which for him was roughly equivalent to a speech. After Agatha left, they stayed in the kitchen without speaking for a while. Marshall had appeared from somewhere and installed himself on the table, which was against every rule but had been a losing battle since day one, and Thorne scratched the cat's chin absently while he stared at nothing. He's really going to come after you, Lenora said finally. He's been coming after me for 6 years. He didn't look up from Marshall. Just slower than this. Why now? Why push it to a legal challenge? He was quiet for a moment. There's been talk of a rail line, eastern expansion through the mountains. If the survey goes the way some people think, he stopped. Water rights on this ridge could be worth 20 times what they are now if there's a railroad needing reliable water sources through the pass. She let that sit. A railroad changed everything, the scale, the urgency, the amount of money behind Holt's interest. Men who were willing to wait for 6 years over a water table would not wait patiently when railroad money was on the table. When did you find out about the rail survey? She asked. October. He met her eyes. Around the time I put that notice on the post office wall. She held his gaze. You were already expecting trouble. I was already living with trouble. He looked back down at the cat. I thought. He stopped. Started differently. A man on his own in a dispute like this is easier to dismiss, easier to destroy, legally or otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. 2 people are harder. She was very still. You put that notice out because you were looking for help, she said carefully, not just company. Yes. He said it without apology but without ease either. I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, she said, which I appreciate more than most things. He looked at her. She looked back. I should have told you sooner, he said. You should have, she agreed. But you're telling me now, and I'm still here. She pushed back her chair. So, the Petersons, when can we go? He made a sound that was almost a sigh. Saturday, if the road's passable. Saturday, she said, and got up to start dinner. And Marshall watched them both from the table with the inscrutable satisfaction of a creature that knew something. The road to the Peterson homestead was passable on Saturday, barely, and they went together on horseback because the snow was too deep for the wagon. Thorne rode ahead where the drifts were uncertain, testing the surface, and she followed on Pebble, who had developed strong opinions about snow and expressed them vocally but moved through it anyway. The Peterson place was smaller than Thorne's, a single-story house with a low barn and a wood pile that stretched the length of the south wall. Eric Peterson came out when he heard them coming, a tall, thin man with a weathered face and careful eyes. He looked at Thorne, he looked at Lenora. Something shifted in his expression. Mercer, he said, not unfriendly, cautious. Peterson, Thorne dismounted. This is my wife, Lenora. We were in the area. They were absolutely not in the area. The Peterson place required a 40-minute ride on a specific trail that went nowhere else. Eric Peterson knew this as well as Thorne did, and the slight twitch of his mouth said so. Come in then, he said. His wife, Marta, was inside with their son, the boy who'd had the fever. Jakob, 12 years old now, healthy and solid, who looked at Thorne with round eyes and the particular reverence children have for people who are very large and have been, at some key moment, very kind. Marta Peterson put food on the table without asking. That was how people did things up here, Lenora had learned. Hospitality wasn't offered. It was simply enacted, because you didn't let people sit at your table hungry. They ate and they talked, and Lenora let Thorne lead most of it, which she could see cost him. He wasn't comfortable with social conversation, treated it like a fence he had to get over rather than a road he could walk, but he got over it. Talked about the winter, the livestock, the state of the Eastern Trail. Eric Peterson talked back, cautiously at first, then with more ease. Lenora talked to Marta. Marta was quiet and direct, the kind of woman who'd built a life by being practical and didn't have much patience for anything else. She asked Lenora how she was finding the ridge. Lenora told her honestly, hard, cold, strange, and not as terrible as she'd been warned. Marta almost smiled. It takes a certain kind, she said. I think it takes more kinds than people expect, Lenora said. Marta looked at her for a moment. Holt's been talking, she said, low enough that the men at the other end of the table couldn't hear clearly. I know, Lenora said. Eric doesn't believe him. Eric's never believed him about your husband, not after the winter with Jakob. She looked at her hands. But believing and acting are different things for people up here. You don't act unless you have to. What would make it have to? Lenora asked. Marta met her eyes. If something happened that made it clear which way the danger was actually sitting. Lenora nodded slowly. Then let's hope something makes it clear, she said. When they rode back up to the homestead in the late afternoon, the light going gold and thin through the bare trees, Thorn was quiet for most of the ride. Then, about a mile from home, he said without looking at her, "That went better than I expected." "You did well," she said. "I didn't do anything." "You showed up," she said. "For a man who spent 8 years not showing up anywhere, that's something." He was quiet for another moment. Their horses moved steadily through the snow. "The boy looked at me like I was someone worth looking at," he said. It was said very quietly, almost like he hadn't meant to say it. She didn't make it into more than it was. "You drove him through a storm when he needed it. That's not a small thing to a 12-year-old. "It was a blizzard," he said. "I couldn't have left him." "No," she agreed. "You couldn't. That's rather the point." He said nothing else. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed very slightly, and she rode beside him up the last mile of the trail, thinking that this was how things actually shifted. Not in moments of dramatic revelation, but in small accumulations, in showing up, in the patient work of being one person alongside another until the distance between them closed enough to matter. They got home in the dark. Thorn fed the horses while she started supper. Marshall met her at the door with the aggressive affection he reserved for people returning from long absences, winding between her boots with complete disregard for physics. She set water to boil and put the lamp on, and stood for a moment in the warm kitchen with the cold still on her coat, listening to the sounds of the homestead settling around her, the horses in the barn, the wind picking up on the north slope, the particular creak of the porch board when Thorn's weight came onto it. She was afraid. She hadn't let herself feel it fully until now, in the quiet of the kitchen, but it was there, the real kind of fear, not of Thorn, not of the cold or the isolation, but of what was coming. Holt was not a man who stopped. The lawyer in spring was real. The riders in the tree line were real. The tracks in the fence line snow were real. And she had bet on something, on the idea that the quiet debts and small kindnesses and patient conversations she was stitching together would hold when Holt pulled the thread. She didn't know if she was right. She opened the door for Thorn when he came up the porch steps, and he came in and hung up his coat and looked at her standing by the stove, and something in his face asked a question he didn't put into words. "I'm fine," she said. "You look like you're thinking hard about something." "I'm always thinking hard about something." She handed him a cup. He took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch, but almost did, and she was aware of almost, which was its own kind of information about where things stood between them. "What happens in spring," she said, "when the lawyer comes? Worst case, what happens?" He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Worst case, Holt's legal argument holds long enough to tie up my claim while he applies pressure from the other side. Long enough that it becomes easier to sell than fight. And you won't sell. I won't sell," said with a quiet, absolute certainty that had nothing to prove. "Then we need spring to find us better prepared than we are now." She turned back to the stove. "We have 3 months. Lenora," he said her name carefully, like he was trying it out in this particular context. "What exactly are you planning?" She stirred the pot. "I'm planning to make sure that when Holt makes his move, he doesn't find a man alone on a mountain. He finds something more complicated than that." She paused. "I'm planning to make it harder for him to tell his story when there are enough other people ready to tell a different one." I was silent for a long time, long enough that she turned to look at him. He was watching her with that undefended expression, the one she'd first seen when he talked about his mother's book. "Why?" he said. It came out quietly, like he'd been holding it for a while. "I was honest with you. I told you part of why I needed." He stopped. "But you could have taken that information and walked away, Left before winter got worse. I wouldn't have—" He stopped again. "Why are you still here?" She thought about it for a moment, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to say it the right way. "Because you're worth staying for," she said, "and because I don't walk away from things I've decided to do." She held his gaze. "And because Wendell Holt is exactly the kind of man I have spent my entire life watching get away with things, and I am—" She took a breath. "I am tired of watching men like that win." The stove burned. The mountain pressed cold against the walls. Thorn Mercer looked at his wife for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Tell me the plan," and she did. The plan she laid out that night was not complicated. Complicated plans failed when pressure came, and pressure was coming. What she described was something simpler and harder, the kind of thing that required patience and nerve in equal measure and couldn't be rushed. She needed witnesses, not allies in the fighting sense, not men who would stand beside Thorn with rifles when Holt's people came. She needed people who had seen enough of the truth to say so when it mattered, people whose word meant something in the settlement and the surrounding ridge country, people who, when a lawyer from Billings started asking questions about the character of the man on the high ridge, would have answers that didn't match Holt's story. She needed them willing, and she needed them safe enough to speak. Holt can't go after everyone, she told Thorn that night, the lamp burning low between them. That's his problem. He built his story around you being isolated, one dangerous man on a mountain that nobody's willing to defend. The moment there are 10 people willing to say different things, the story breaks. Thorn looked at the table. And if Holt decides those 10 people are a problem, then he becomes something worse than a land grabber. He becomes a man making war on a settlement. She held his eyes. And that is a different thing entirely. That brings outside attention. That is not something even a man with a lawyer from Billings wants. I was quiet for a long time. She could see him turning it over, looking for the hole in it, because that was how he thought. Searching for what could go wrong before he committed to anything. She'd come to respect that about him even when it slowed things down. "It could still get violent," he said, "before it gets to witnesses and lawyers." "Yes," she said, "it could. If that happens, we deal with it." She kept her voice steady. "But I'd rather have it not happen, which means doing this right and doing it before spring." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "All right, what do you need from me?" What she needed from him was harder than anything she could have asked him to lift or build or fight. She needed him to be present, to show up at the settlement trading post gatherings, to nod at people, to drink coffee next to men who'd been afraid of him, and let them slowly revise that fear into something more manageable. She needed him to be the version of himself she'd been watching in private, the man who talked gently to horses and kept his dead mother's botanical book and drove sick children through blizzards. And she needed him to do it in public, which was the part he hated most. Hum did it badly at first, that was the truth of it. The first time they went to the Thursday settlement gathering together, he sat in the corner of the trading post, like a storm system, looking for somewhere to discharge, and 2 men near the door found reasons to leave within 15 minutes of their arrival, and the conversation in the room went stiff and careful, the way conversations do around someone people are afraid of. She didn't make it worse by trying to fix it in the moment. She just talked to Agatha, to Martha Peterson, who'd come down for supplies, to a young trader named Callum who ran freight up the eastern passes and knew everyone within 40 miles. She talked easily and naturally and let the comfort she projected slowly loosen the room. And at some point, Callum started talking to Thorn about the state of the North Pass Trail, and Thorn answered in monosyllables at first and then in actual sentences. And when they left an hour later, the room behind them was warmer than when they'd arrived. "That was awful," Thorn said on the ride home. "It wasn't that bad. The Halverson brothers left when we walked in." "The Halverson brothers are scared of their own shadows," she said. "They leave when anybody new walks in. Don't count them." He rode in silence for a moment. "Callum seems all right." "Callum is better than all right." She'd made a point of talking to the young trader for 20 minutes, learning his routes, his stops, who he talked to. He moves through this part of the mountains more than anyone. He knows where things stand between people. Did he tell you anything useful? He told me that 3 families on the eastern flatland are behind on payments to Holt. That Holt's been generous about extending those debts, which means those families feel they owe him, but they're not comfortable with it. She guided Pebble around a route in the trail. Debt that doesn't feel clean is debt that's looking for a reason to switch sides. Thorne glanced at her sideways. You got all that from a 20-minute conversation about freight routes. I got all that, she said, because I listened. He looked back at the trail ahead of them. She thought she saw the corner of his mouth move. They went back the following Thursday and the one after that. Thorne got slightly less terrible at it each time, in the way a man gets better at something he dislikes, through sheer repetition of the disliking. He learned Callum's last name, Reed, and remembered it the next time, which Callum noticed. He talked to Silas Briggs about a problem with a ploughshare and actually helped, because Thorne knew iron and knew tools, and that was the kind of conversation he could have without feeling like he was performing something. Silas started nodding at him in the street afterward, which was small and was real. February ground on cold and grey and relentless. Gruber delivered the written account of Holt's meeting to Silas Briggs, signed and dated, 7 pages of close handwriting that described exactly what had been said and who had said it. Silas sent a copy to Deputy Hollis with a covering letter of his own. Hollis sent back a brief reply acknowledging receipt and promising to look into the matter, which meant probably nothing, but was on paper, which was something. Lenora kept the original in the bottom of her sewing box, under the good wool she was saving for a winter coat. She decided the sewing box was the last place anyone would search. She also started writing things down herself, a journal essentially, dated entries describing the tracks at the fence line, the riders in the tree line, the conversation overheard in the trading post before Christmas. She wrote carefully, factually, without embellishment, dates and details and the names of anyone who'd witnessed anything alongside her. Thorne read it once, looking uncomfortable the way he always looked at things that made his situation concrete on paper, and said it was thorough. It's not enough, she said honestly. It's something, but it's not enough. What else do we need? We need Holt to make a move before he's ready for it to be documented. She closed the journal. We need him to do something visible, something people see. Thorne looked at her steadily. You're thinking of provoking him. I'm thinking of making him impatient. She met his eyes. There's a difference. If we keep building relationships in the settlement, keep putting Gruber's account in front of people, keep showing up, Holt is going to feel the ground shifting, and men who feel the ground shifting make mistakes. Or they stop being careful, he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a particular way, which isn't the same as making mistakes. Sometimes that's just violence. She'd thought about this too, had thought about it at length in the cold dark of her room at night, listening to the house settle. I know, she said. That's why we need to be ready for both possibilities. Ready how? She said it plainly. I need to know how to use your rifle. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. No, he said. Thorne, you're not... He stopped. His jaw was tight. I'm not going to teach you to shoot so you can stand in a field and exchange fire with Holt's hired men. That's not what this... I'm not talking about standing in a field, she said, keeping her voice even. I'm talking about not being helpless if something happens when you're not here. I'm talking about being a person who can protect the house if she needs to. She paused. You go out on that property alone every day. If someone came while you were on the far side of the pasture, nothing's happened here at the house. Nothing's happened yet. She looked at him. Teach me. I'm not asking you to like it. I was quiet for a long time. Marshall jumped onto the table and settled between them like a mediator, and for once nobody moved him. Saturday morning, he finally said, before it gets above freezing, while the light's good. She nodded. You're not going to enjoy it, he said. It wasn't a warning exactly, more like a prediction. I don't need to enjoy it, she said. She did not, in fact, enjoy it. The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, and the kick was startling, and her first 6 shots went into the hillside with varying degrees of relationship to where she'd been aiming. Thorn stood beside her and corrected her stance twice and her grip once, and didn't say anything when the fourth shot went wide enough to be embarrassing. Again, he said, "I know. You're flinching before the shot. You're anticipating the kick. I said I know." Knowing and not doing are different. She looked at him sideways. "Are you going to tell me about the bear again?" Something moved in his face. "If you'd like." "I would not like." She raised the rifle, steadied herself, thought about stillness, thought about the bear story, actually, despite herself. The idea of making yourself small enough that the thing coming at you loses interest, the particular courage of not flinching. She fired. The shot hit close enough to where she'd been aiming that Thorn actually turned his head to look at the target. "Better," he said. "Thank you," she said, and reloaded, and didn't say anything about how her shoulder was going to hurt for 3 days. March arrived with a grudging thaw that turned the yard into mud and made the road down to the settlement, a treacherous sliding mess that took an hour to navigate carefully. The snow retreated up the slopes but didn't leave, just pulled back to the high ground and waited. Things that had been frozen all winter began to move again. Water and mud and trouble. The first sign of it came from Callum Reed, who stopped by the homestead on a freight run in the first week of March with a deliberateness that made clear the stop wasn't incidental. He tied his horses and came up to the porch where Lenora was working on the mending, and he took off his hat and said he thought they should know something. "Holt brought 2 men up from Billings last week," he said. "Not the lawyer, different men, bigger." He turned his hat in his hands. "I saw them at the trading post. They weren't making conversation." "Did you hear anything?" Lenora said. "I heard the word easement. I heard before the survey crew arrives." He looked at her, then at Thorn, who'd come out of the barn. "I don't know exactly what he's planning, but it's got a deadline attached to it." "The railroad survey," Thorn said. Callum nodded. "If the survey confirms what people are saying about the water table up here, this land gets valuable enough that a legal dispute gets very expensive and very complicated. Holt needs to have this settled before that happens." "How long do we have?" Lenora asked. "Survey crews expected in late April, best I've heard." Callum put his hat back on. "That's 6 weeks, maybe 7, after he left." Thorn stood in the yard with his hands at his sides, looking at the south pasture. She stood beside him and didn't say anything for a moment. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she agreed. "That's not enough time." "It's what we have." She looked at the tree line, bare now and grey in the early March light. "We need to move faster." What moving faster looked like, it turned out, was uncomfortable and necessary, and not the kind of thing either of them was naturally suited to. She started being direct with people she'd been building towards slowly. Agatha, Martha Peterson, Callum himself, 2 of the farmers from the eastern flatland who'd come to the Thursday gathering more regularly than Holt probably knew. She was honest with them about the timeline. She showed Agatha the journal. She told them what the 2 men from Billings probably meant. Most of them listened. Some of them went quiet and non-committal in the way people do when they're calculating risk, and she couldn't blame them for that. Calculating risk was how people survived out here, but 3 of them, Silas Briggs, Eric Peterson, and Callum Reed, said variations of the same thing, which was that they'd had enough of Holt's quiet pressure and his stories, and if it came to saying so in front of Deputy Hollis or anyone else, they'd say so. 3 people. It wasn't an army. But it was something that hadn't existed in November. The trouble came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March, and it didn't come from where she'd expected. She was at the settlement trading post, picking up a package of wool that had come in from the supply run, when she heard raised voices from outside. She went to the window and saw Thorn. He'd come down separately that morning to speak to the blacksmith about a harness fitting, standing in the middle of the street with 2 men she didn't recognize. Big men. One of them had a hand on Thorn's arm. She was out the door before she'd fully decided to move. She came up behind the 2 men at an angle, close enough to hear. The one with his hand on Thorn's arm was saying something about how it would be better for everyone if Mercer understood what the situation was, and Thorn was standing very still, with the stillness she recognized as the controlled kind, the kind that was 1 degree from the other kind. "Let go of his arm," she said. All 3 of them turned. The man holding Thorne's arm looked at her with the particular blankness of someone who had written her off before she spoke. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am." "That's my husband," she said. "So it does. Your husband has some decisions to make about—" "Take your hand off his arm," she said again. Her voice was level. Her heart was going very fast. "Or I'll go inside and get Silas Briggs, who is right behind that door, and Deputy Hollis's office will have a letter about this incident before supper. I have been keeping very detailed records." Something shifted in the man's face, not fear exactly. These weren't men who scared easily, but calculation. He let go of Thorne's arm. "Mr. Holt just wants to have a conversation," the second man said. His voice was easier, more practiced. "No need for this to get difficult." "Then Mr. Holt can write a letter like a civilized man," Lenora said, "and stop sending people to put their hands on mine." She looked at Thorne. "Are you all right?" Thorne's jaw was tight enough to crack. "Fine," he said. She turned back to the two men. "I suggest you go tell Mr. Holt that his approach is being documented. Every incident, every face." She met both their eyes in turn. "We know about the meeting in February. We know about the cut fence last winter. We know about the riders in the tree line." She paused. "Does he understand that?" A long moment. The street around them had gone quiet, the particular quiet of people pretending not to watch while watching intently. The first man said nothing. Then they both walked away, down the street toward the eastern road without looking back. She stood there until they were out of sight. Then she let out the breath she'd been holding, and her hands started shaking, which she hadn't anticipated, and quickly put behind her back before Thorne could see. He saw anyway. He was very observant when he was paying attention, which she'd learned meant he was almost always observant. "I didn't say anything about the hands," he said. "How did you know Silas was behind that door?" "I didn't," she admitted. "I thought he probably was. He's usually there Thursday mornings." Thorne looked at her for a long moment. "And if he wasn't?" "Then I'd have improvised." She flexed her fingers, trying to steady them. "Did they hurt you?" "No." He looked down at his arm where the man's hand had been, like checking. "No. They were establishing something, not actually." He stopped. His face had gone through several things she hadn't been able to track fast enough. "You should have stayed inside. I know. That was—" "I know," she said again. "It was stupid. Don't tell me it was stupid." "It was brave," he said. She looked at him. He said it like he meant it, simply, without dressing it up. "Thank you," she said. Silas Briggs appeared in the doorway of the trading post at that moment, looking between them with an expression that suggested he'd seen more than he'd let on. "You two all right?" "Fine," Lenora said, "though I wonder if you'd be willing to make a note of what you saw. Time, date, description of the men." Silas looked at her, then at Thorne, then back. "Already writing it down," he said. That night, back on the ridge, Lenora sat at the kitchen table and was honest with herself about how close that had been. Not close to violence, maybe. Those men had been there to intimidate, not to escalate in public, but close to something. Close to the edge of the thing she'd been managing so carefully for months. She'd stepped into the street and said words she wasn't sure she had the power to back up. And it had worked this time. Because the men were calculating, and because Silas had been in that doorway, and because Holt wasn't ready yet to have a public incident on record. But Holt was getting ready. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing on the mountain, not seeing it yet, but feeling the pressure shift, the air go still in the particular way that meant something was gathering. Thorne came in from checking the horses and sat across from her. He looked tired in a way that wasn't physical, the kind of tired that came from years of a thing. "They'll come back," he said. "I know. Next time won't be in public." "I know." She looked at her hands, steadier now. "Which means we need to not be alone when it matters. We need people who will come." He looked at the table. "You think Briggs would come? Peterson?" "I think they might," she said, "if we ask, directly." She met his eyes. "That's the part neither of us has done yet. We've been building toward it, but we haven't asked." I was quiet for a moment. People don't like being asked to put themselves between someone else's trouble and their own safety. "No," she agreed, "but some of them will, if they trust that it's real and that it matters." She paused. "You drove Eric Peterson's son through a blizzard, Thorne. That man is sitting on that north slope right now with a healthy 12-year-old because of you. He might be willing to drive 4 miles if you asked him directly." Thorn looked like this thought caused him something, not pain exactly, but the discomfort of something he'd been keeping arm's length suddenly being right in front of him. "I've never asked anyone for anything," he said, "not since Billings." "I know," she kept her voice gentle, not soft but gentle. There was a difference. "It's time." He sat with that for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind came up the north slope and pressed against the house walls, and the house held, the way it had always held, because Thorn had built it to. "Together," he said finally. She nodded. "Together." They rode to the Peterson homestead the next morning. Eric came out when he heard them, and he saw their faces, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at them both standing in his yard in the early March cold. Then he said, "Come inside, Marta's got coffee." Thorn looked at the ground, then up at the man in front of him. "I need to ask you something," he said, "directly." Eric Peterson nodded. "I figured," he said. "Come in." They went in. The kitchen was warm and smelled like pine and coffee, and Jacob looked up from the corner where he was doing something with a piece of leather, and then looked quickly back down with 12-year-old studied casualness. Marta poured without asking. Thorn sat down at the table, and Lenora sat beside him, and he said what he needed to say plainly and without apology. What Holt was planning, what the timeline was, what he was asking for. Eric Peterson listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he looked at his wife. Marta looked back with an expression that clearly continued a conversation they'd already been having privately. "You're not alone up there," Eric said. "You haven't been, not for a while now. I think you know that." He looked at Thorn steadily. "I'll come if you send word. Silas will too. He told me so after Thursday. Callum Reed said as much to my face 2 weeks ago." Thorn looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, still. "I'm not asking anyone to fight my battles." "I know you're not," Eric said. "We're not offering to fight them. We're offering to stand there while you fight them." He paused. "There's a difference, and it matters." Thorn was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "it does." On the ride home, with the mountain bright and cold around them and the snow retreating further up the slopes in the early March sun, Lenora rode beside her husband and thought about what was coming and felt afraid and resolved in equal measure, which she'd learned were not opposites but companions. She'd set something in motion that she couldn't unset. The thread she'd been pulling for 4 months had found enough tension that pulling it further would either hold or snap, and she wouldn't know which until Holt made his move. She'd made her gamble. She'd asked for her cards. Now she had to wait for the hand to be played. The wait ended on a Wednesday. She knew it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky shows it. Something in the air, something in the particular silence of the morning. She'd woken before dawn with her heart already going faster than it should have been, and she'd lain still in the dark listening to the house and the mountain around it and couldn't identify what had woken her. She got up anyway, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching the south pasture in the grey pre-light, and nothing moved. And still she didn't go back to bed. Thorn came down an hour later and found her at the window and didn't ask why she was up. He poured coffee and stood beside her and looked at the same pasture, and they stood there together in the kitchen quiet until the light came up enough to see the tree line clearly. Nothing in the trees, nothing at the fence. "Today feels wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I went out to the barn as usual." She started her morning work as usual. But she kept the rifle within reach, which she'd been doing every day for 3 weeks now, and she left the kitchen door unlatched so it would open fast if she needed it to. The men came at mid-morning. Not 2 this time. Not watchers at the tree line. 5 riders coming up the main trail from the settlement road, riding with the purposeful, unhurried pace of people who have decided something and are simply executing it. She saw them from the kitchen window while she was working on the ledger, and she stood up slowly and went to the door and said, "Thorn," loud enough to carry to the barn, and waited. He appeared in the barn doorway. He saw the riders. He came to the porch without running. They stood on the porch together as the 5 men rode into the yard, and stopped their horses in a loose group about 20 feet out. She recognized two of them, the same men from the street confrontation 2 weeks ago, the ones she'd faced down outside the trading post. The other three were new. All of them had rifles in their saddle scabbards. None of them had drawn. The man who'd been holding Thorne's arm in the street was the one who spoke. He did it with the air of a man reciting something he'd been told to say, which she filed away as useful. Wendell Holt has authorized us to inform you that your land claim on this ridge has been found deficient under territorial statutes. You're being given notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. Thorne stood very still beside her. I have a legal claim. Mr. Holt's lawyer has reviewed it. The original filing is incomplete. That's a lie, Thorne said, flat, not heated. Regardless, you'll receive formal notice from the county seat. You didn't come up here to deliver legal notice, Lenora said. All 5 men looked at her. 5 men on horseback with rifles isn't how you deliver a legal notice, she said. That's how you deliver a different kind of message. She looked at each face in turn. So let's be honest about what this is. The spokesman's jaw tightened. Ma'am, this doesn't. My name is Lenora Mercer, she said, and this is my home. She kept her hands at her sides and her voice steady, and she was aware of the rifle just inside the door, and aware that 5 against 2 was a calculation she couldn't win if it went in that direction. I'm going to ask you to turn around and ride back down the trail, a sound from the spokesman that might have been a laugh. And if we don't, she said, then in about 10 minutes, this is going to be considerably more complicated than you planned for. She was not bluffing. She was also not completely certain of her timing. The next 4 minutes were the longest of her life. Thorne stood beside her and said nothing, and she could feel the particular controlled stillness coming off him. The bare story stillness, the kind that held something enormous very carefully. And she did not look at him because she needed to keep her eyes on the 5 men in the yard, and she thought very specifically about not flinching. Then she heard it, hoofbeats. More than one horse coming up the settlement road, and from a different direction, a second set from the North Slope Trail. Silas Briggs came around the south end of the tree line first, riding with Eric Peterson beside him, and Callum Reed a half-length behind. From the North Slope Trail came a man she recognized as Gruber, the farmer who'd been at Holt's meeting, who'd written everything down, and beside him 2 men she didn't know, but who had the look of people with no particular interest in being friendly. 7 people. They rode into the yard and stopped, spreading without discussion into a loose line that said what it needed to say without anyone drawing anything. Silas looked at the 5 men. The 5 men looked at Silas, looked at all of them. Silas Briggs, the spokesman said, and something in his voice had shifted. Tom, Silas said. He said the name like he knew the man, like they'd eaten at the same table before, which made it worse somehow. Not strangers, not enemies, just people who'd ended up on different sides of something. Didn't know you were working for Holt now. I'm doing a job, Tom said. What kind of job needs 5 men and long guns to deliver a legal notice? Silas said. Nobody answered that. Tom looked at Thorne, then at Lenora, then at the line of people behind them. She could see him counting, recalibrating, running the math of a situation that had not looked like this when Holt had sent them up the mountain this morning. This isn't over, he said. I didn't say it was, Thorne replied. Tom turned his horse. The 4 others turned with him, and they rode out of the yard the way they'd come. Not fast. Fast would have been a loss, but with the particular deliberateness of a retreat that's trying not to look like one. When they were out of sight around the first bend, Lenora let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Silas dismounted. He was a stocky man with a grey beard and a face that didn't show a lot, but he looked shaken in a careful way. You all right? He asked Thorne. Fine. Thorne's voice was rough. He cleared it. I didn't know if you'd come. You asked, Silas said simply. Callum Reed had dismounted too and was looking at the trail where the 5 men had gone, his expression calculating. That was Tom Aldridge, he said. He's been doing rough work for Holt for 3 years. He doesn't back down easily. He looked at Lenora. Whatever you said bought you time, not resolution. I know, she said. Eric Peterson came up onto the porch. He looked at Thorne for a moment, then at Lenora, and he said, You sent the word at first light. I left before Marta had breakfast on. He said it without complaint, just as a fact. How long have you been standing out here? 10 minutes, she said, felt longer. Gruber, the farmer, heavy-set and clearly uncomfortable with confrontation in a way that told her what it had cost him to ride up here, came up last and stood at the edge of the porch with his hat in his hands. He hadn't met Thorne before, she realized. He looked at the big man the way people looked at Thorne when the story of him hadn't yet been replaced by the reality. Thorne looked back at him, then he put out his hand. Gruber looked at it for a moment, and then he shook it. Thank you for coming, Thorne said. I should have... Gruber stopped. Started differently. What I wrote down about that meeting, that happened. Holt said those things. He looked at the ground. I should have said so sooner. You said it when you could, Lenora said. They brought everyone inside because you didn't leave people standing in a yard. She made coffee, which was automatic and necessary, and gave her hand something to do while her mind worked at what had just happened and what came next. The kitchen was crowded in a way it had never been. 7 extra people in a space built for 1, then reluctantly expanded for 2, and Thorne stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed and the look of a man who was profoundly uncomfortable with this many people in his kitchen and was choosing to be uncomfortable rather than ask them to leave. She caught his eye across the room. He looked back. Something passed between them that didn't have a name yet, but was warm and specific and entirely theirs. Silas was talking. Holt's going to try again. He's got too much riding on this to walk away because we showed up. Agreed, Callum said. The question is how. Legally first, Lenora said. He'll push the county seat claim harder now. Try to get something on paper before the survey crew arrives. She set cups on the table, which means we need Deputy Hollis up here in person before that happens. Hollis doesn't like the mountains, Silas said. Hollis doesn't like the ride, she said. That's different, and I think if enough of us write to him, separately, specific, documented, he'll come. She looked at Silas. Your letter last month got a response. That means there's a record. Add to it. And the legal claim? Eric asked. He was looking at Thorne. Is it clean, the filing? It's clean, Thorne said. I had it reviewed 3 years ago. There's nothing wrong with it. Then we need a lawyer of our own looking at whatever Holt's man is planning to argue. Callum leaned forward. I move freight to Billings twice a month. I can find out which law office his lawyer is from, and I can find another one. Thorne looked at him. That costs money. Some things cost money, Callum said in a tone that didn't make it a favor or a sacrifice, just a fact. It went on like that for 2 hours. Practical, unromantic, occasionally tense when someone's estimate of the risk differed from someone else's, and nobody entirely agreed on everything, and Gruber kept looking at Thorne like he was still revising his understanding of the man sitting across the table from him, which was fair enough. What came out of it was a list of things that needed doing, assigned to specific people, with specific timelines. She wrote it in the back of the ledger while they talked, because if she didn't write it down, it would be 7 different memories of 7 different conversations, and they didn't have time for that. When it was done, people started leaving in 1s and 2s, back down the trails to their own lives and their own homesteads. Silas was last. He stood at the door with his hat and looked at Thorne and said, You should have asked sooner. Thorne looked at the floor. I know. People would have come. I know that now. Silas nodded once and put on his hat and left. They were alone in the kitchen. The coffee was cold. Marshall had retreated to the top of the shelving unit during the crowd, and was now descending with elaborate dignity, pretending he hadn't been hiding. Lenora sat down at the table. She was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the particular cost of sustained intensity, the kind of tired that came from holding everything together by force of attention for hours. Thorne sat down across from her. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. You knew they'd come, he said. You sent word at first light. I sent word last night, she said, when I couldn't sleep. He was quiet. You knew this morning was going to happen. I thought it might. She pushed her cold coffee cup aside. I told you it felt wrong. Yes. He put his hands on the table. Large hands, scarred, the kind that showed everything they'd done. When Tom Aldridge said 5 men wasn't enough, I saw it in his face. He'd planned for 1 man on a mountain. He paused. He didn't plan for what we'd built. She noticed the pronoun. She didn't remark on it, just let it sit there between them like something new that had taken a while to grow and deserved a moment without being picked up and examined. It's not finished, she said. No. He met her eyes, but it's different now. She understood what he meant. Something had broken this morning that couldn't be repaired from Holt's side. The fiction that Thorne Mercer was an isolated, dangerous man on an empty mountain that nobody would defend. 5 riders had ridden up to deliver a message and found the message already answered. That would get back to Holt before dark. What Holt did with it was the question. She didn't have long to wait for the answer. Callum sent word 4 days later through Agatha Briggs, who brought it up the ridge herself. Holt was furious. That much was in the settlement's water supply by now. Everyone knew it. Men who worked for him were walking more carefully and talking less. But the word Callum had sent wasn't about Holt's anger. It was about something more specific and more dangerous. Holt had offered money to Tom Aldridge to come back, not to deliver notice, not to negotiate, to remove the obstacle. She read the note twice at the kitchen table while Agatha watched her face. Does Silas know? She said. Callum told him this morning. And Deputy Hollis? Callum rode to town himself last night. Agatha's voice was tight. Hollis said he'd come up, couldn't promise when. She set the note on the table. When is Aldridge supposed to move? Callum doesn't know exactly. Soon. The survey crew arrives in 3 weeks. Thorne was in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd come in. She looked at him, and he looked at the note on the table and then at her. And the conversation that passed between them was faster than words. I need to get to Hollis directly, she said, before Aldridge moves. Lenora, if Holt has paid men to come after you, that's not a land dispute anymore. That's criminal conspiracy. She kept her voice even. Hollis needs to understand that before it happens, not after. The road to town is half a day each way, Thorne said. If something happens here while you're... Eric and Silas are 4 miles away, she said. Callum is closer. She looked at him. And you are here. His jaw worked. I don't like it. I know. If Aldridge moves while you're on the road, then you deal with it, and I deal with what's in front of me. She stood up. We've been doing this together, Thorne. That means we're in different places sometimes. That's what together actually looks like. He was quiet for a long moment. Agatha had gone very still near the door, the particular stillness of someone trying to be invisible. Take Pebble, Thorne said finally. She's surer on the mud than the brown. I know. She put her hand briefly on his arm as she passed. Not a gesture of reassurance exactly, more like acknowledgement. I see you. I'm going anyway. We're all right. He didn't move, but some of the tension in his arm changed. She left within the hour, with the journal wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag, and Gruber's signed account, and the letter Hollis had sent in response to Silas, and every piece of paper she'd been building for 4 months. The mud on the settlement road was deep from the March thaw, and Pebble picked her way through it with the patient, resigned competence she brought to everything. And Lenora rode, thinking about what she needed to say to a man who had been content to stay in town and let mountains handle their own trouble. She arrived in Black Hollow Ridge in early afternoon and went directly to the deputy's office, which was a 1-room building next to the post office that smelled like tobacco and old leather. Hollis was behind his desk, a round-faced man in his 40s with a lawman's careful eyes and the look of someone who had been expecting this visit, the way you expect weather you've been watching build. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and stood, which surprised her. Deputy. She sat down across from him. She was muddy from the ride and tired, and she didn't apologize for any of it. I need to tell you what's happening on that ridge, and I need you to actually hear it. He sat back down. I'm listening. She talked for 40 minutes. She put the documents in front of him, the journal, Gruber's account, the correspondence, and she walked him through it, start to finish, without dramatizing it, just the facts and the dates and the names, the same way she'd been writing them down all winter. She told him about the meeting, the fence, the riders, the street confrontation, the 5 men in the yard. She told him about the money to Aldridge. Hollis listened without interrupting. He picked up Gruber's account and read it. He looked at dates in the journal. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what you're describing, if accurate, is serious enough that me going up there with anything short of—" "I understand," she said. "That's why I'm here. You need to go up with enough that it means something, and you need to go before Aldridge moves. I don't have a lot of men. You have Silas Briggs and Eric Peterson and Callum Reed and Gruber, all of whom will stand witness." She met his eyes. "This isn't Thorne Mercer causing trouble on his mountain deputy. This is Wendell Holt paying men to remove a landowner so he can seize water rights before a railroad survey." She paused. "Think about how that reads to the county seat, to the territorial office." Something shifted in Hollis's face. He was a political man enough to follow that line of thinking without her having to draw it all the way. "When would you want me up there?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before Aldridge has another night to plan." He looked at his desk, looked at her, looked at the documents. "I'll bring my deputy and 1 other man," he said. "That's what I've got." "That's enough," she said. "If you're in uniform and you're there." She rode back up the mountain in the last of the afternoon light, pushing Pebble harder than she usually did, because she didn't want to be on the trail in full dark. She made it to the homestead as the sky went deep blue-gray above the ridge and the first stars showed themselves through the bare branches. Thorne was on the porch. He'd been there a while by the look of it. "Hollis is coming tomorrow," she said, dismounting. He took Pebble's reins without being asked. How did he take it? Like a man who had been waiting for someone to give him enough to act on. She rubbed her cold hands together. "He's not a bad man. He just needed the information." Thorne led Pebble toward the barn. She followed because the barn was warm and she wasn't ready to go inside yet. He moved through the familiar routine, unsaddling, rubbing the horse down, checking her feet, with the quiet efficiency she'd been watching for 4 months now, and she stood just inside the barn door and let herself feel the full weight of what tomorrow was. The confrontation was coming, tomorrow or after, when Aldridge got word that a deputy was on the mountain, when Holt understood that the net she'd been weaving was closing around him. Something was going to break open, and she didn't know exactly what shape it would take. She was scared. She'd been scared before and had done the thing anyway. But this was different. This was the kind of scared that came from knowing it wasn't just her. "Thorne," she said. He looked up from Pebble's left foreleg. "Whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped, tried again. "I need you to stay controlled, whatever they say or do. You can't give them the version of you they're expecting." She held his eyes. "You have to let me and Hollis carry the talking." He stood up slowly. She could see him not liking this. "If it gets physical, then it gets physical and we deal with it, but not before." She crossed the barn to stand in front of him. He was so much larger than her that this close she had to look up, which she'd stopped noticing months ago. They built their entire story on you being dangerous and ungovernable. The moment you confirm it, even a little, Hollis loses his ground. She paused. "Don't give Holt the story he needs. Make him stand in front of witnesses with nothing." He looked down at her for a long moment. His face in the barn lamplight was very serious and very still. "You've thought about this more than I have," he said. "I've been thinking about it since December," she said. I was quiet. His hands, which were at his sides, moved slightly. Not a reach, not quite, but the beginning of one that stopped itself. She was aware of the small distance between them and the particular quality of his attention, which was different in this moment from the calculating assessment she'd first seen across a muddy street in November. Something older in it, less defended. "All right," he said. "I'll follow your lead." She nodded, stepped back, let out a breath. "Good," she said. "Then let's go inside. It's cold and I missed supper." The ghost of that almost smile. "I saved you some." "You cooked?" "It's edible," he said, which was not exactly a yes. She walked ahead of him toward the house, and behind her she heard him check the barn latch and then follow, and the mountain was dark and enormous above them. and somewhere below it, Wendell Holt was sitting with his money and his plans and his story, and tomorrow was coming, whether any of them were ready for it or not. She was as ready as she was going to be. They both were. It would have to be enough. Deputy Hollis arrived the next morning with 2 men and arrived earlier than she'd expected, which told her he'd taken the night to think about what she'd put in front of him and had come to his own conclusions about urgency. She was already up when she heard the horses on the trail. Thorne was in the barn. She stepped onto the porch with her coffee and watched Hollis ride into the yard. Round-faced, careful-eyed, looking like a man who had spent the pre-dawn hours deciding something. And she felt the particular tension of a day that had already committed to being what it was going to be. "Mrs. Mercer," Hollis said, dismounting. His 2 men stayed on their horses, looking around the yard with the automatic wariness of men trained to read ground. "Deputy," she looked at the trail behind him. "Did you see anything coming up?" "Tracks on the lower switchback. 4 horses, probably from last night or early this morning." He said it evenly, like weather. "They circled around the south end and went back down. Whoever it was, they saw our horses and didn't like what they counted." She let out a breath. Aldridge had come and gone. She didn't know if that was better or worse, the confrontation delayed, or the calculation changed. Thorne came out of the barn and stopped when he saw Hollis. Something moved in his face, not hostility, but the ingrained wariness of a man who had learned that official authority mostly arrived to make his problems worse. She watched him push that down and hold his hand out. Hollis shook it without hesitation. "Mercer, I've been on that desk for 3 years, and this is the first time we've met face to face." "Your predecessor wasn't interested in coming up here," Thorne said. "My predecessor had different priorities." Hollis looked around the yard. "Can we go inside? I want to look at those documents again, and I want to hear from you directly what's been happening." They went inside. She made more coffee, which at this point felt like it might be her primary contribution to frontier justice, and she sat at the kitchen table and listened while Thorne talked to Hollis in the careful, factual way he'd learned to talk about things that mattered. Not the compressed silence of before, not the shut door, but an actual account of 6 years of slow pressure and cut fences and riders in the tree line. Hollis listened and asked questions and wrote things in a small notebook with the deliberate shorthand of a man who'd been doing this a long time. He asked about the 2 men from Billings, about Aldridge specifically, about the legal claim and when it had been filed, and where those documents were held. "County seat," Thorne said. "Filed in 1887. The receipt and copies are in the root cellar in a tin box." Hollis looked at him. "Why the root cellar?" "Because it's the last place anyone who broke into this house would look," Thorne said. Hollis almost smiled. "Go get them." Thorne went. Lenora looked at Hollis across the table. "The tracks this morning, 4 horses." "Aldridge runs with 3 others when he's doing this kind of work," Hollis said. "That's his usual number." He looked at his notebook. "They'll come back. The question is when and whether they come back with Holt's authorization to do more than threaten." "Holt is desperate," she said. "The survey crew is 3 weeks out. If Aldridge doesn't move soon, Holt loses his window." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "What you built up here, the witnesses, the documentation, the relationships in the settlement, that changes things considerably. A man coming after a lone homesteader on a remote ridge is a different legal situation than a man coming after a homesteader surrounded by witnesses and paper." He paused. "I want you to understand that this still might get ugly before it gets clean." "I know that too," she said. Thorne came back with the tin box. Hollis went through the land documents carefully, cross-referencing dates in his notebook, and after 20 minutes he set them down and said, "The claim is clean. If Holt's lawyer has filed a challenge at the county seat, it's built on nothing." "Can you find out if he has?" Lenora said. "I can send a wire this afternoon." He looked at Thorne. "I want you to know, I should have come up here sooner. What's in those documents your wife kept?" He stopped. "That's a pattern, not a dispute. I should have seen it." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "You're here now," he said. "It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't blame either. Just a man acknowledging a fact and choosing to move forward from it, which was about all you could ask of anyone. Silas and Eric arrived around 9, having gotten word the night before to come at first light. Callum showed up 20 minutes after, road dusty and direct. Gruber came last, looking like a man who had made a decision that cost him something and had decided the cost was acceptable. The kitchen that had never been built for one person handling this many was handling 8, and it was loud in the particular way of people who were all paying attention and all had something at stake. Hollis talked. People asked questions. Lenora mostly listened and watched the room and thought about the tracks on the lower switchback and whether Aldridge was watching the homestead right now from the tree line, counting horses and doing the same math she was doing. 4 hours. That was how long before everything changed. She was outside with Callum near the barn, talking through what he'd sent to the Billings law office when she heard the horses. Not the trail, the south end of the property, through the trees, where there wasn't a proper trail, but there was a way through if you knew it or had scouted it. Callum, she said quietly. He heard them too. He turned. His hand went to his coat without being theatrical about it. 4 riders emerged from the tree line at the south pasture edge, moving fast. Aldridge was in front. She recognized him from the street, the controlled, aggressive posture of a man who'd committed to something. They weren't stopping at the fence line this time. "Hollis," Callum called, already moving toward the house. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not clean or cinematic. It was loud and confused and frightening in the specific way of real dangerous situations, which don't arrange themselves for clarity. Hollis came out of the house with his badge, showing, and his hand on his sidearm, and his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who had decided where he stood. He put himself between the 4 riders and the porch and called Aldridge's name and told him to stop, and Aldridge didn't stop immediately. He kept coming another 20 feet before he pulled up, which was close enough that Lenora, standing at the barn corner with the rifle she'd gone to get, the moment she heard the hoofbeats, could see his face clearly. He hadn't expected Hollis. That was evident. He was recalculating fast, his eyes moving over the yard. The deputy, the 2 lawmen fanned out, Silas and Eric on the porch, Callum in the yard, Gruber hanging back near the water trough with an expression of a man sincerely hoping this would resolve without him having to do anything physical, and Thorne. Thorne was standing to the right of Hollis, and he was doing what she'd asked. He was still, not the explosive stillness of barely contained violence, but something harder and more deliberate, a man choosing, consciously and visibly, to be something other than what his reputation said he was. His hands were at his sides, his face was controlled, he was letting Hollis carry it. She didn't know what it cost him, she suspected it cost a great deal. "Tom Aldridge," Hollis said, "I'm placing you under formal notice that this property is under investigation for criminal conspiracy in connection with Wendell Holt. You are on private land without invitation. I'm asking you to turn your horses around." Aldridge looked at Hollis, looked at Thorne, looked at the assembled people in the yard with the eyes of a man running numbers that no longer added up in his favor. "Holt has a legal claim on this property." "Holt's claim has been reviewed," Hollis said. "There's no valid challenge to this filing. Any lawyer who told him otherwise is mistaken or dishonest." He took 1 step forward. "You have paid employment to be on this mountain today. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what that employment is going to cost you." A long silence. One of Aldridge's men, the youngest, maybe 25, sitting his horse with the look of someone who had not signed on for a deputy and 8 witnesses, turned his horse sideways, then turned it toward the tree line. Aldridge saw it. His jaw went tight. "Tom," Hollis said, and his voice dropped in a way that made it more serious, not less. "Don't." Another silence, a long one. Aldridge turned his horse. It wasn't surrender, it was calculation. A man smart enough to understand that the situation had changed entirely, and that what Holt had sent him to do was no longer achievable and possibly no longer worth the risk. He rode back through the tree line without a word, and his 3 men went with him, and the south pasture was empty again. Nobody in the yard moved for a full 30 seconds. Then Gruber sat down on the edge of the water trough and put his face in his hands, and Silas let out a breath that seemed to last a full minute, and Callum said something very quietly that wasn't appropriate for polite company, and that Lenora absolutely agreed with. Thorne turned and looked at her across the yard. She was still holding the rifle. She lowered it carefully, engaged the safety the way he taught her, and she looked back at him and nodded once. He nodded back. It was not a dramatic moment. It was two people who had been through something together acknowledging it to each other across a muddy spring yard, and it was enough. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing real ever was. She laughed, reading it, alone in the kitchen at the table. A real laugh, the kind that came from being genuinely surprised by something. Marshall looked up from his spot by the stove with the expression of an animal that knew it had missed something but was too dignified to ask what. Thorne came in from outside and looked at her, still laughing, the letter in her hand. He stopped. "What?" he said. She held out the letter. He took it, read it. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but close, and warmer than the almost smile she'd been collecting all winter. "She told people you saved me," he said. "She tends toward the dramatic." "She's not entirely wrong." He set the letter down on the table. He was standing across from her in the kitchen that had organized itself around both of them now. Her skillet on the hook, his tools on the shelf, the ledger with both their handwriting in it, the botanical book his mother had left sitting open on the windowsill where the light was good. "Lenora," she looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it since March, and I've been doing it badly." "All right," she said. He looked at the table, back at her. He was not a man built for this kind of conversation, and they both knew it, and she could see him choosing to do it anyway, which was its own form of courage. "I didn't give you an honest deal when I put that notice up. I told you about the land and the winters and the work. I didn't tell you about Holt and what you'd be walking into." "No," she said, "you didn't. I told myself it was because I didn't want to scare you off, but that wasn't—" He stopped. "I was using you as a strategy, and you became something else, and I didn't know how to—" He ran out of sentence, tried again. "You deserved better than what I offered you." She thought about this for a moment. It would have been easy to say it was fine. It worked out. Don't worry about it. It would have been the comfortable answer. "Yes," she said, "I did." He looked at her. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't that. "And I'm still here," she said. "Not because it worked out, because I chose to be. Every day I've been on this mountain, I've chosen it." She held his eyes. "That's different from stumbling into something that turned out all right. I want you to know the difference." I was quiet for a long time. The summer kitchen was warm around them, and the mountain outside was doing its slow, reluctant green, and somewhere on the south slope a bird was doing something insistent and repetitive that Marshall had been tracking through the window all morning. "I know the difference," Thorne said. "I just don't—" He stopped. His hands were at his sides, and she could see the effort in him, the reaching towards something that 8 years of isolation had made very far away. "I don't know how to be someone worth choosing. I've been trying to figure that out since November." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she put her hand against his jaw, the scarred one, the bear scar, the thing that made people flinch when they first saw it, and she held it there. "You already are," she said. "You have been for a while. You're just the last one to know it." He put his hand over hers, large and careful, the same careful grip from the handshake in front of the diner 8 months ago. The grip that had known it was handling something it didn't want to break. His eyes were very close. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I notice," she said. "I go silent, for days sometimes." "I know. I don't—" He stopped. "I don't know how to be what you need." "You've been learning," she said, "and so have I." She kept her hand where it was. "That's what this is, Thorne. Neither of us knows how to do it perfectly. We just keep doing it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved against the back of her hand. "Stay," he said, "just that. Not a declaration or a performance. Just a man asking for something directly, the way she taught him, the way he'd been learning all winter." "I'm staying," she said. He bent his head and kissed her, and it was not graceful. He misjudged the angle slightly, and she had to adjust. And Marshall chose that exact moment to jump onto the counter and knock a cup sideways with a crash that startled them both apart. Thorn looked at the cat. The cat looked back with complete absence of remorse. She laughed. He laughed, the real one, the same sound she'd first heard over a story about the cat and a chicken leg in December, and it was just as good the second time. The summer moved through the ridge the way summers did up there. Too short, too valuable. Every warm day a small treasure because you knew what was coming. They worked the land together through June and July, getting more done in 2 than had ever gotten done in 1, because that was the practical truth of a partnership that had something to it besides proximity. She expanded her kitchen garden. He built a second covered wood pile that would hold twice the previous winter's supply. They argued about the placement of a new fence line for an afternoon, and compromised on something that was neither of their original positions, and turned out to be better than both. Callum Reed stopped by in August on a freight run, with news from the settlement and the easy familiarity of a friend rather than an informant. He told them that Holt had sold 2 of his eastern properties. The legal costs and the inquiry and the withdrawal of railroad interest had tightened his position considerably. He was still in the territory, still had money and land, but he was a smaller man than he'd been in February, and everyone in the settlement knew it. "Nobody's sorry about it," Callum said, drinking coffee on the porch in the August afternoon. "I'll say that much." "How are the families?" he threatened, Lenora asked. "The Norris family paid off their debt in June. Don't ask me how. They say they found buyers for some timber." Callum looked at his cup. "The other family's still under it, but Holt's been quieter about calling it in." "If they need help," Thorn said, and stopped. He looked slightly surprised at himself for starting the sentence. Callum looked at him. "I'll tell them." After Callum left, Thorn sat on the porch steps and didn't say anything for a while, looking out at the south pasture where the cattle were moving in the late afternoon heat. She sat beside him, not quite touching, the easy distance of 2 people comfortable enough with each other that distance didn't signal anything. "That was different," she said. "What was?" "What you said to Callum about the family." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I have more than I need," he said. "I always have. I just didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't have anyone to have more than enough with." She looked at him. He looked at the pasture. "Now you do," she said. "Now I do," he agreed. The summer folded into fall, and fall into the first warning cold of another winter, and the ridge became the thing it always became when the temperature dropped. Self-contained, complete, a world with its own rules and its own rhythms and its own hard particular beauty. She'd survived 1 winter up here. She'd come through it with more than she'd brought, which was the only accounting that mattered. The town of Black Hollow Ridge didn't transform overnight. Towns didn't. But things had shifted in ways you could measure. People in the settlement who had watched Lenora ride up the mountain in November, knowing she was making a mistake, now stopped to talk to her on Thursday visits without the pitying eyes. Marta Peterson brought her a cutting from a plant she'd been propagating. Practical, specific, the kind of gift that said, "I think you'll be here long enough to need this." Silas Briggs, at the December gathering, introduced Thorn to a man newly arrived in the settlement with the words, "This is Thorn Mercer. He runs the Ridge Homestead. Good man to know if you're staying in this country." Said it easily without ceremony, like it was simply true, which it was. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood on the post office sidewalk in November and taken a notice off the wall while everyone else stepped back. She thought about what she'd known and what she hadn't, and she thought about whether, knowing everything now, she'd make the same choice. Yes, she would. Not because it had gone well, it hadn't gone smoothly or without fear or without the possibility of going very badly, but because the things worth having were almost never the things that came easily, and she had understood that at 31 on a quiet street in a small frontier town with a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. What she hadn't understood then, what she understood now, was that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was also the most true, the most honest, the most fully yourself, and that sometimes a person who was supposed to save someone else turned out to be saving themselves at the same time, which wasn't a betrayal of anything. It was just how life actually worked when it worked. The snow came early that 2nd October, which Thorn had predicted in September, watching the behavior of the animals in a way she was learning to read herself. She stood on the porch the morning the first real snow fell and watched it come down through the bare trees, soft and heavy and indifferent, the mountain doing what it had always done. And she felt the cold settle around her and felt, underneath the cold, the warmth of the house at her back, the fire in the kitchen stove. Marshall installed on his porch chair despite the snow, because Marshall made his own decisions about weather. The sound of Thorn in the barn, talking low to the horses the way he always did. This was what she had built, not a perfect life. Imperfect people didn't make perfect lives, and she'd stopped believing in perfect at 22 anyway. But a real one, a true one that had been tested against real pressure and held, not because she or Thorn were exceptional, but because they'd been honest and stubborn and willing to ask for help when they needed it, which was the hardest thing either of them had ever learned to do. The snow kept falling, the mountain kept being the mountain, and Lenora Vale Mercer stood on her porch in her good heavy boots and watched it come and stayed.